Okay, so we will be looking at Ezra chapter 9, where we kind of left off yesterday. So what we've seen is the temple had been destroyed. They had the 70 years of captivity. God stirs up the spirit of Cyrus to send Israel back to the land to rebuild the temple. This is Ezra 1 through 4. It says it's a fulfillment of prophecy of what Jeremiah had said, but also Isaiah before that had mentioned Cyrus would be used by God to send the people back into the land before Cyrus even existed, 200 years before Cyrus was even heard of. And so anyway, there is a return to the land. There's kind of those 3 rounds of return. One starting in about 539, when Cyrus makes a decree under this guy named Sheshbazzar, who leads the people into the land. The next one is under Ezra himself. He is a leader who takes the people, next round of people, back into the land. He is a priest, someone who knows the Word of God, wants to teach the law to the people, as we'll see. And so he'll be an important spiritual leader. I think he's the one who writes and compiles both Ezra and Nehemiah. And so he goes back into the land, is going to focus on rebuilding the temple, especially starting with the altar and getting the sacrificial system going again. And so that's the next round. And then Nehemiah is a few years later, about the 440s BC. You start reading about that in Nehemiah chapter 1, obviously, and he leads the next round going back, but his focus is to build and rebuild the walls of the city of Jerusalem so that they have some protection from enemies. And so even though the people go back to the land and it's clear that God is at work and is fulfilling his statements of relief from exile to Jeremiah, what we kind of see during this time is, this is a phrase that I want us maybe to keep in mind when we're studying Ezra, Nehemiah, and even Esther, books that are kind of in this post-exile time. There is good that's happening, but it's not good enough. It's not sufficient to fulfill everything that God has promised, and it's not intended to be. Daniel had it revealed to him that there would be more kingdoms, that there would be longer time than people expected for God to fulfill his plan to send Messiah. And so we saw that there are missing pieces. We also see that there are internal problems as well as external problems, and so we'll talk about that as well. But just to give us some idea again of what the people are kind of thinking, feeling in their disappointment and discouragement during this time, can somebody read Isaiah 2 through 4? No, it's not in Ezra, but that's kind of my point. Sure, let's do it. Eli? Thank you.
2 through 4?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now it will be that in the last days the mountain of the house of Yahweh will be established as the head of the mountains, and will be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations will stream into it, or to it. And many people will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of Yahweh, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may instruct us from his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For from Zion the law will go forth, and the word of Yahweh from Jerusalem, and he will judge between the nations, and will render decisions for many peoples. And they will hammer their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn war."
Okay, thank you. So that extended passage is, let's just put it this way. Does that, even though they've returned to the land in Ezra and Nehemiah, does that happen? Isaiah 2 through 4.
What happened?
Does what you just read in Isaiah 2 through 4 happen in Ezra and Nehemiah? No. And that's what the nature of people's disappointment is they thought, okay, we've been told by Isaiah and others, this is just a sample of one of the things that it talks about, where it talks about Zion's going to be lifted up as the chief of nations. Jerusalem's going to be kind of this capital of the world. Israel's going to have this international respect and dominance. God himself is going to reign there. His presence is going to be there. The nations, the Gentiles, are going to stream to Zion to learn about God, to hear his law, to see the Davidic kingdom. There's going to be international peace. The nations are going to quit going to war, and they're going to hammer their swords into plowshares, meaning they're going to change war tools into farming tools, and because they will be unnecessary, and God will rule in such a way that there will be justice between all the nations, and he will be the wise and just decision maker about these hard cases. And so that's kind of what people are thinking, and there's going to be the new heart and the new covenant and all this stuff. When they go back to the land, they're thinking this is going to happen now. And so God is at work, but it's not the situation that takes place in Ezra and Nehemiah. That is still yet to be fulfilled in the future. So you can see why the New Testament is not an add-on that just comes out of nowhere and just says, we decided to write more Bible one day. It's that there needed to be more work, God intervening, more revelation, the coming of Messiah, in order to actually accomplish those things. And that's why the Old Testament ends that way, is that you're waiting for the next thing where God will work again, where he will send Messiah to accomplish and produce his kingdom, and that will be through salvation. And so Ezra is recognizing that there's problems, during this time. There's problems of that they're surrounded by enemies. The people, remember how what I said, what's their main spiritual problem during this time? I kind of boiled it down to one word, that you could say it other ways, but they don't worship other gods anymore, so that's good. But their problem is what when they come back to the land? What's the kind of main, not particular sins, but kind of the main category of sin that people are engaged in now? It's not idolatry, but what? Remember, so they're going to not observe the Sabbath. They're not going to finish building God's house, his temple. They're going to marry foreign unbelievers. Yeah, Vivian?
They're not really caring about what God has said.
Yes, they don't care as much about God's priorities. They live their own lives. The way that we can put this is worldliness is their main issue during this time. And so if you actually want scriptures and illustrations and examples for dealing with worldliness in yourself, or encouraging someone else, or teaching on that subject someday, these post-exile books are good ones to do that from. Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, Ezra, Nehemiah. Those are good books to look at the subject of worldliness. And so Ezra, as all this stuff is happening, they do rebuild the altar, they do rebuild eventually the temple, but they take a 15-year break on building the temple. To be fair, because they're threatened, the surrounding enemies send letters to the king saying, if they rebuild this temple, they're going to rebel against you. And so the people take a break on building God's house for 15 years, go back to their family properties, and focus on building themselves really nice houses, which there's nothing wrong with having a really nice house, but they kind of let the temple just lapse. And that's where Haggai and Zechariah will come in Ezra chapter 5 and 6 and say from God, you need to continue building the temple. And so we'll look at that a little bit in Haggai today. But they also, it's not just external stuff that's going on, there's internal problems as well. The people marry foreign wives, meaning they often, as Malachi indicates, divorce their own spouse and marry someone who's an unbeliever. And that's going to lead them into further worldliness. And then in Nehemiah, they're trading on the Sabbath. They don't give God his full tithe. Malachi talks about them doing stuff like they have a kind of sick and not very good sheep, and they have like a healthy one. They keep the healthy one for themselves and offer the sick one to God. They kind of oppress each other financially, and different things are going on with that. They, just all sorts of problems that they have during this time that shows they're not really caring about what God cares about and His plan and project for what's going on during this time. So in Ezra 9, Ezra hears about these marriages, and it says he's appalled, and he sits down, he tears at his beard and his hair, he tears his robes, he weeps, he mourns, and then he prays a prayer of confession on behalf of the people in Ezra 9, which is a great prayer to read. But can someone read Ezra 9:9 again? We read this at the end of yesterday, but it is a kind of powerful statement that gets repeated in Ezra and Nehemiah of how they interpret themselves during this time. Yeah, Vivian, thank you.
For we are slaves, yet our God has not forsaken us in our slavery, but has extended to His steadfast love before the kings of Persia, to grant us some reviving to set up the house of our God, to repair its ruins, and to give us protection in Judea and Jerusalem.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you. So he says, God's shown loving kindness and given us favor in the eyes of these kings of Persia to go back and build Him a house, which they now did, but he says, but the fact of the matter is we're still slaves. They're not under direct chattel slavery where somebody owns them and forces them to labor, but they are not an independent nation. They're owned by the Persians. They have to follow their laws. They have to pay taxes to them. And so they are not this holy nation, kingdom of priests, dominant, influential nation that God said they would be if they obey God. They don't have a king. And so there's all these things going on that Ezra interprets it as, we're slaves, which is significant because, remember, Exodus, Israel, when they're created as a nation, are slaves. Then they go through all this time, and because of their sin, they also end the Old Testament. We're still slaves because of their sin. And so Ezra recognizes God is working, but he says there are a lot of barriers, problems in the way. There are external problems of enemies trying to stop us and attack us, but it's not just that. There's internal problems of people's sin and lack of obedience to God. And so that's what's going on in Ezra 9 and 10, where the book ends, is they do this, the men who have done this, married these foreign unbelieving wives, are called and commanded by Ezra to do a one-time divorce and to put away the foreign wives among them, because it was a marriage that never should have taken place. Not because they're foreigners, but because they worship foreign gods. That's what the issue is, and they lead them into further worldliness. They're commanded not to do this, but they did. Deuteronomy 7 says not to do this. Solomon did this, and his heart was led away, right? And that was his fault because of his sin. And so the people come, and after Ezra confronts them, they confess to this. But listen to this, even just how this is described. Try to picture this in your mind. Ezra 10:9 says, "So all the men of Judah and Benjamin assembled at Jerusalem within 3 days," because Ezra had called them, "and it was the 9th month and the 20th day of the month, and all the people sat in the open square before the house of God, trembling because of this matter in the heavy rain." Right? So you can kind of see this kind of dark picture of the people who have sinned now coming to deal with that, and they're afraid of what's going to happen, and it's raining. Right? So you can picture this, kind of it indicates that stuff is not good right now. And so Ezra in 10:10, he says, "Then Ezra the priest stood up and said, 'You have been unfaithful and have married foreign wives, adding to the guilt of Israel. Now therefore make confession to Yahweh, God of your fathers, and do His will, and separate yourselves from the people of this land and from foreign wives.'" And so they did that. Now God, during this time, Malachi 2:14, God will say, "I hate divorce." And he says, "You've been acting treacherously against the wife of your youth and against your spouses." A lot of times people would divorce their wife, who was a believer to marry a foreign unbeliever who worshipped other gods. And Malachi is saying, God hates this, that you're doing evil. And then once you did that, you couldn't go back and be married to the same person. It was the whole land is defiled as far as God is concerned when they did that. So this is not something that's in God's desire for marriage, but it's the state of what's going on with the Jews during this time. Okay, so it shows you that the problem is not just outside of them; it's inside of them. And so, the New Testament indicates that we're not supposed to marry unbelievers either, because they have a different loyalty, different authority. That being said, the New Testament in 1 Peter and 1 Corinthians indicates that, if somebody, let's say two people are already married, they were unbelievers, one of them gets saved, the New Testament's clear that the person should remain married, given those conditions, not divorced just because the person is not a believer, that there is an honor to the covenant of marriage in that sense. But here in the end of Ezra 10, it talks about, Ezra ends in kind of an interesting way. And I don't think it really ends because I think it's actually connected with the book of Nehemiah. But we'll talk about that in a second. Ezra ends by giving a list of names of all the men who had sinfully married unbelieving wives. And then it ends in 1044 saying, all these had married foreign wives, and some of them had wives by whom they had children. So further complicates the situation. And so, you could imagine during this time, if your name was recorded in the Bible for all time, but it's recorded for something that you did wrong, a sin that you committed, and you're in the record forever, right? So sometimes we're like, oh yeah, I kind of wish I lived during that time, this and that. But it's like, yeah, it's probably better that, a lot of our stuff is not recorded in the Bible. But anyway, so Ezra, now flip over to the book of Nehemiah. Now we're going to hear about round of return and kind of era number 3. Ezra and Nehemiah are contemporaries. They're friends. They're co-leaders. Nehemiah is going to be a spiritual leader, but also more of kind of the building and governing leader. Ezra is going to be more the spiritual and priestly and kind of Bible leader, worship leader. But they're going to work together, because you read that Ezra comes to preach the word of God, the law of God, in Nehemiah chapter 9. Okay, so now I think these books, we should view them as connected, because if you look at kind of how the book is structured throughout it, you see themes that continue across both books. So we can kind of divide them, but the Jews always viewed them as one book. Now, it's not a big deal if you do or don't. It's just understanding that the story continues in Nehemiah. Now the question is, Nehemiah is written, a lot of it is in first person, meaning Nehemiah is saying stuff about himself and his experience. But the argument is that Ezra, also writes Nehemiah. Well, how could that be the case? Well, remember, Ezra is a compiler and a collector as well as a writer. He's the one who's the author putting it together. Right, so have you guys ever seen a book that has, it has several authors contributing, but it has one editor who kind of puts the whole book together? So when you guys may have come across this, I don't know, but in like Mr. Collins' class or something, it's kind of hard to even cite the book, because you're like, do I put the editor's name for the in-text citation, or do I put the author's name and then say it's in this thing? I don't know if you guys have come across a book like that, but it's kind of like if you wrote some document, and then I said, okay, that's good. I'm going to take that document and I'm going to include that in my book, but I'm going to say, this is what they said. We're both kind of the authors at that point. So I think that's kind of what Ezra does, is he takes documents from Cyrus, from other kings, he has letters in there. He has Nehemiah's journals in there, and so he kind of compiles it all together. It's a pretty cool work of history when you think about it that way. Now Nehemiah's job, he is a cupbearer in Nehemiah chapter 1 to King Artaxerxes. Okay, and Artaxerxes may sound like a name of a king that's familiar to us. Artaxerxes, what does that name remind us of? And he's not called, he's kind of named after his father, but his father's not really called that by that name in the Bible. Think to a book we just studied. Xerxes is arguably his dad. He has another name. Anybody remember? King Xerxes marries someone that's a book we just studied. Esther, and his other name in Esther is Ahasuerus. Yeah, or you could say it different ways. It's not that really important, but this is arguably his son. You could make an argument, that may not be, but so he may be the stepson of Esther. Okay, so Nehemiah is his cupbearer. Do you guys understand the role of what the cupbearer is for? What's the cupbearer? Why is he trusted and important? Or a cupbearer? Yeah.
Isn't he the one that prepares the drink and stuff for the king and then tastes it just in case it's poison?
Yes. He has a kind of risky job, but also kind of a fun job in a way, because as long as you don't get poisoned, you're doing pretty good. But yeah, this is a very trusted position relative to the king, because you have access to the king's food and drink. You test it before giving it to the king to make sure it's not poisoned. So yeah, you're putting your life on the line, but you get to eat the king's food, and you're also in a very trusted position because they trust this person not to poison the king or kill the king or assassinate the king. It's kind of like, even though he shouldn't have been trusted, you guys remember Eglon, the really fat king from Judges, lets Ehud, the left-handed guy, into the bathroom with him to tell him the secret message. One of the trusted positions in, actually all over ancient history, not so ancient history, England as well, medieval England, if you were the king's bathroom attendant, that was a very trusted position, and you could give the king advice and all sorts of things because you're in a position where you're vulnerable. Similarly, the cupbearer is in a different way. It's a less gross job, but you're in a trusted position relative to the king, so you're close. You're probably friends, and so Nehemiah is this Jew that's positioned relative to the king to be used by God in this way. And so he is upset about something. He's grieving. Can somebody read Nehemiah 1:3? Sure, Abby, thank you.
And they said to me, the remnant there is in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates are destroyed by fire.
Okay, so main problem now is not so much, there is a temple. They had kind of walls and gates that they had built for protection, but now the walls are broken down. Okay, so what you guys have to understand during this time period, while the Jews are living in the land, they are very vulnerable. They're surrounded by nations and groups who do not like them. Do not like that they're there, do not like that they're building a temple in a city. And to be fair to them, they do know that when Jerusalem was dominant, had a king like Solomon or David over it, or Josiah, that they were kind of untouchable as far as the nations went. So they do not want this city or the temple to be rebuilt. So you guys remember when we went up to the Hollywood Impact Studios and did that work up there? Imagine if while we're trying to do that, you're being threatened the whole time that people might jump out of the woods and raid and kill us. Anyway, so you have to wear a sword, somebody has to guard you while you work, somebody has to guard you while you get a drink or go to the bathroom or eat or anything like that. You have to be constantly on your guard. That's what's going on in Ezra and Nehemiah as they try to rebuild the walls. They're having people constantly attack and threaten them. And then they're having these people write letters to the kings of Persia saying, don't let them do this. They're not going to obey you. They're going to stop paying taxes. They're not going to follow your law. They're going to revolt against you. And so they have all sorts of pressures on them, just that we need to appreciate during this time. So Nehemiah weeps during this time, prays to God and says, God, give me favor in this. He fasts and he prays multiple days about this. And then he goes, he says in 2, and the end of chapter 1, he says that he's the king's cupbearer. Okay, so he goes into the king and he says he does not try to show any emotion or what's going on, because as the cupbearer, if you act any way that's not normal, then you're under suspicion. But the king sees, because of Nehemiah's face, that he says that something that he thought he was, it seems like he's sick, but he says it seems like you're actually sad. What's going on? And Nehemiah tells him. He tells him, my city's broken down, the tombs of my fathers, the city is in ruin, it's consumed by fire. And so he prays, and the king gives Nehemiah permission to take materials, permission to leave him and go rebuild and oversee the rebuilding of the walls and gates of Jerusalem. So that's pretty significant. And so he sends him out to do this. Nehemiah, it's a secret what he's going to be doing. He keeps it a secret when he goes back to the land. He keeps it a secret from the Jews and also the surrounding people, because he knows as soon as they start that there's going to be resistance. Okay. Now, why is this event in Nehemiah? I'll put it this way. Artaxerxes gives him a decree, basically a royal decree to rebuild Jerusalem. Why is that significant in, let's just say, God's overall plan for history? Why is the decree to rebuild Jerusalem significant? Think Daniel. What did God say about once there is this decree to rebuild Jerusalem? Because remember, God tells Daniel that there would be that this is going to play into his plan, even relative to the coming of Messiah. Guys, remember the questions we answered about Daniel last week? Kind of like one of the last things that we talked about in Daniel. Yeah, now we go.
About God giving the new heart and forgiving the sins.
Well, yes, that will be connected, but think about the coming of Messiah. Does Daniel predict when Messiah will come in Daniel 9?
Yeah.
He does. How do we know when the countdown begins to Messiah? Because he says there will be this many weeks. Yeah, Abigail.
70 weeks.
Okay, 70 weeks. And then Eli?
There would be a decree that to rebuild Jerusalem.
Yes. So, Daniel's prophecy in Daniel 9:24 through 27, God says there's going to be 70 weeks total for me to accomplish my entire plan for the kingdom. Until the coming of Messiah, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. That's 69 weeks, 483 years. There's going to be a countdown of 483 years to the coming of Messiah. How do we know when the 483 years starts? In Daniel 9, he says, when there's a decree to rebuild Jerusalem, start counting down the 483 years until Messiah. So Nehemiah is actually beginning that fulfillment of that prophecy, because there is the decree to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. That's where the start line starts. And if you count down 483 years, that brings you to the ministry of Jesus and his death, right? Which Daniel said would happen as well. And the Messiah will be cut off then the temple will be destroyed. So this is how we know when to start counting down. If you look at even the notes in Daniel 9, 24 to 27 in the MacArthur Study Bible, it will even narrow it down to month and day. And he says that that day lines up with when Jesus comes in on Palm Sunday, the week before he's crucified. While that's helpful, I think it's also helpful to kind of understand at a period of time that they had 483 years to get ready for the coming of Messiah. Okay, so the building of the walls and the decree from Artaxerxes is when that countdown starts. Okay, does that make sense? So we're seeing the start line, and Jesus is at the finish line of that prophecy of Daniel. Okay, so Nehemiah is able to go back. He goes back and looks around at the walls, sees that they are broken down, and doesn't tell anybody what he's planning yet. And so he sees that it's been burned, but then he wants to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Okay, so he announces his plan to the people, and he's going to lead and oversee this plan. Okay, so immediately there's going to be some problems. In chapter 4 of Nehemiah, the surrounding nations threaten and try to discourage them from building the walls. But here is, and this is something I put here that could be relevant for Ezra as well. You have external opposition as one problem, but you also have internal sin as another problem. It's not just that the people are harassing them from outside, it's that the people themselves are sinful and they are not obeying God. And that's going to be a problem here as well. So throughout the book, Nehemiah's phrase that he says to God is, he basically says, I'm trying to do what's right and accomplish this work. God, remember me that I tried. Remember the taunts and the sin of people who tried to oppose us, and don't let them succeed. So he constantly says, remember me throughout the book. So chapter 5 in Nehemiah, the people are charging each other interest, which normally isn't a bad thing. You guys understand what interest is? It's like if you let me borrow $100 and a year from now I agree to pay you back $110, I'm paying you back not just the original amount, but I'm paying you back for the time that you didn't have the money and the time that I got to use the money sooner. So you guys understand what interest rates are, right? So that's what that is. It's just a price to borrow money through time. Normally, like the Bible permits that for business contracts and stuff like that. But where it didn't permit it is if another believer comes to me and says, I'm, really stuck here. Can you loan me some money so I can just get out of this situation that I'm stuck in, and I will pay you back? I can have two options for a believer. Well, actually 3 options. I can say no. Maybe if I don't think they're doing what's right, I could say no. I could say yes and expect the money to be paid back without interest. Or I could say yes and just not expect the money to be paid back. And it's just a gift at that point. Those were kind of the options for a charitable loan. What the people here were doing is people would come in very difficult circumstances and they'd say, okay, look, I'm trying to get out of this. And they'd say, okay, I'll give you the money, but in a year from now, you got to pay me back this much interest. And so Jews were not supposed to, according to the law, you weren't supposed to do that on charitable loans between believers. And so Nehemiah confronts them on this in chapter 5, that they're not keeping God's law relative to each other. The enemies plot against them in chapter 6, but they do finish the wall. Okay, and more people do come back to the land, but not all. So it's not everybody returns to the land. So this is a good thing, but it doesn't totally fulfill all that's necessary. Okay, in chapter 8 they have a Bible conference. Ezra is invited to read and preach the law to the people. That they need to know God's law, they need to know God's word, and they even translate for people who speak different languages because they've been in exile to help them understand what the law is saying. And so the people are encouraged, convicted by the law of God, the Word of God. They're somewhat saddened because of their sin. Different things going on during this time. But they're happy because they have the temple, they have the wall rebuilt, and they thought that would be impossible. They thought there was no way that could possibly be done. And so the people are weeping because they're convicted by the law that they haven't been keeping it. And this is what Nehemiah says. A famous, somewhat well-known verse comes from Nehemiah 8, 10 and following. He says, "Then he said to them, go and eat of the fat and drink of the sweet, and send portions to him who has nothing prepared. For this day is holy to our Lord. Do not be grieved, for the joy of Yahweh is your strength." We say that a lot, right? The joy of the Lord is our strength. He's saying, look, you're convicted for your sins. That's good. But he says, you know what? It's the joy of the Lord, what he's doing on your behalf, that should give you strength to keep going, to obey, so you should actually be happy in what the Lord is overall doing. Okay, so they celebrate this, and then the people in chapter 9 confess their sins. And I'm going to have, and this is a great prayer of confession. They basically walk themselves through history and they say, yeah, if we look at our nation, at every stage of our nation, there's been great sin against God, our fathers and us. And we confess that all. Okay? Can somebody read Nehemiah 9:36? This is their self-assessment. Even though God is being gracious to them, they are confessing all this is good. But listen to how they understand themselves. Bryn, thank you.
Nehemiah 9:36.
9:36, please.
Behold, we are slaves today, and as to the land which you gave to our fathers to eat of its fruit and its bounty, behold, we are slaves in it.
Okay, so he says again, we're slaves to this day. And he says twice in this passage, we are slaves, right? So he says, you know what? We don't have an independent nation under God. And so we're enslaved, and they're really enslaved to their sin, is what. And so you have to get what the Bible is doing here. You understand that. Remember, where Israel starts out toward the beginning of the Bible is as a large group. They start out as slaves in Egypt. God rescues them, saves them. They go through a high point. They go through the exile. They get disciplined. All this takes place to the end of the Old Testament, where they say, we're still slaves. We may be living in our land. We may have the temple. We may have the walls. God is working and has promised to work in the future. But we're still under exile. We are still not, there's not a full restoration yet. And so we're still stuck under slavery. Hence why, if you just end the Bible there, it's not a very good ending, right? You need the New Testament, you need Jesus. And Nehemiah, going on through the book, let me just point out some of the other problems that happen in spite of all this. Time goes on through this. There are still threats from the outside. The wall does get dedicated, but there's trade going on the Sabbath. They open the gates and trade with foreigners who want to trade on the Sabbath. There's this corrupt guy named Tobiah who lives inside the temple, and Nehemiah goes and kicks him out and takes all his stuff and throws it outside. The people aren't paying their tithes to God to basically keep the sacrificial system going. And so they're, in a sense, God says in Malachi, you're robbing me by not paying your tithe for participating in the system. I mentioned the Sabbath. They also continue marrying these foreign unbelieving wives, and mixing these marriages. And so it ends in this state where things are just, it's not good, it's not complete. The people have not really prioritized God's word, his law, etc. And so Nehemiah repeats over and over throughout the book, God, remember me. I tried, but I'm not able to bring it all together. I did these things. You allowed progress to be made in certain ways, but it's not done. It's incomplete. And so at the end, Nehemiah 13:31, he says, remember me, oh my God, for good. He says, so that's how the kind of Nehemiah is signing off of, I did the best I could do. And Nehemiah was a great man of God, but he wasn't enough to fully accomplish everything necessary. Okay, and so that's kind of the last history of the Old Testament. Flip over just briefly to the book of Haggai. Okay, now it's a little confusing because Haggai is not here. It's over toward the end of the Old Testament. Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. This is why it's a little confusing to figure out which books go where, because the history is how they're arranged sometimes is it's hard to know that Haggai and Zechariah, Malachi go with Ezra and Nehemiah. Okay, but they do. They're during this period. And what's nice about Haggai is he's very precise. He tells us down to the year, the month, and the day multiple times in his book of when he's prophesying. So he says, I said this in 1 year. And then he says, I said this. And it's only a 2-chapter book, but I think 3 or 4 times he gives us a date, okay, which is about 520 BC. So Haggai and Zechariah are raised up as prophets for God. Zechariah is a priest. He's probably younger. He writes a little bit of a longer book in Zechariah. Haggai is older. There's some indications that he gives where it seems like he was there to see Solomon's temple go through the fall of Jerusalem and be taken into captivity for 70 years, and how he comes back. So there were a few people who lived long enough, or maybe they were young, during the Babylonian captivity, and now they come back and see the new temple. Okay, and so Haggai is probably one of those. And so he writes during this time. He's described with Zechariah in Ezra 5:1, I think Ezra 6:14. Okay, and his message is very simple. It's basically that they have taken a 15-year break on building the temple. And so he's going to speak to all of Israel, but he's going to speak to 2 particular individuals who are going to be key leaders in getting the temple done. And that's going to be Zerubbabel, who is the descendant of David. He's a civil leader, but he's not a king. He's governor. And Joshua, the high priest. Okay, so he's going to say, hey, you guys need to lead the way on finishing the temple. Okay, look at Haggai 1:3 as we finish up here in the next couple of minutes. Or Haggai 1:2. It says, thus says Yahweh of hosts, this people says, the time has not come, even the time to build, for the house of Yahweh to be built. Okay, so what are they saying there? They're saying, so we understand the house of Yahweh is the temple, but the people have been opposed from the outside. Kings have told them to stop building. There's all these problems. So they take a 15-year break on the temple. What are they saying here in Haggai 1:2? The time has not come, even the time for the house of Yahweh to be built. What's their argument? They're not saying they won't build the temple, but they're saying what? It's not the right time. And so they take 15 years, and Haggai confronts them with a very simple message. Look at Haggai 1:4. He asks a great rhetorical question here. He says, is it time for you yourselves to dwell in paneled houses while this house lies desolate? And so he basically says, look, you took this 15 years, went back to your family's property and built yourself a really nice house. There's nothing wrong with that. But he says, but you forgot about God's house. And so he asks them basically, is it time for you to build your house and ignore God's house? And so God tells them in 2:5 and 2:7 and other places, he says, consider your ways. He says, look, have you noticed you're not being successful in the land? It's like you have a purse that you keep putting money into and it has holes and and the money falls out, and your crops aren't going to full yield, and you're not making as much in your wages. He says, yeah, God's not letting you prosper because you're not prioritizing obedience to Him. And so he tells them, he encourages them, rebuild the temple. And so they do. And Haggai describes this as well. They actually turn to the Lord. They rebuild the temple because God says, I'm with you. Okay, but look at, he says in Haggai 1:13, he says, I am with you, and that encourages them to rebuild the temple. Though, okay, I want you guys to look at this for tomorrow. Haggai 2:3. Haggai is going to look at the temple and say, this temple is not quite, by contrast, is not as great as Solomon's temple, right? And it's definitely not the temple that's described in the future in Ezekiel. And so that makes the people kind of sad, right? But he's going to say, don't worry, God will use this temple and He will fill it with greater glory in the future than has ever been seen before. But he says, you guys recognize that this temple is too small, right? And so the people are kind of sad when they construct the temple. They're happy because it's done, but they're sad because it doesn't match what God said would come in the future, His glorious temple in Ezekiel 40 through 48. But Haggai encourages them. He says, it's okay. I don't know if you guys like SpongeBob, but there's this episode where the little guy in Plankton, he's trying to take over something, and he's saying, he's realizing he's too small to actually win, and he goes, it's becoming increasingly obvious. I can ignore it no longer. I'm small. And he zooms in, he's little. And that's kind of what I think about when Haggai looks at this temple and says, hey guys, look at this temple. Too small, right? Nothing like Solomon's temple. But he says, but that's okay. God's going to use this house and fill it with greater glory in the future. Okay, we'll quit there and get...